I'm Ben Goertzel. I'm a mathematician by training, but I've been in the AI field, for many decades now, and it's a very exciting time to be doing AI. So I played a large role in introducing the subfield of AI called artificial general intelligence. So I've been working on AGI R&D for decades now, and I've also led applied AI projects in a whole bunch of different vertical markets, medicine, finance, language processing, also robotics. I led the software team behind the Sophia robot, who's the first robot citizen. But it's been in my mind ever since really the late '90s when the internet exploded. It's been in my mind that you want the rollout of AGI, general intelligence, as it emerges, like intelligence with imagination, creativity, and scope at the human level and beyond. You want the rollout of AGI to be, decentralized in the rough sense that say the internet is, or the Linux community is. Like you don't want there to be one owner or controller of the early stage AGI systems as their intelligence begins to blossom, because there's all sorts of ways that's likely to lead to the evolution of AGI in the wrong direction. And then as blockchain technology matured, I began to see like this is the right technological infrastructure to use to make uh, to make a decentralized platform for narrow AI carrying out applications now, and then AGI as it emerges into the future. And that's what led me into what I'm doing now with the Singularity Net, which is a blockchain-based platform bringing decentralization to AI.
Right on. So let's just rewind a little, and I want to talk a bit more broadly about decentralization, because a lot of the people I've spoken to, they either talk about it as as a spectrum, or they talk about it as in it's either decentralized or it's not. And some of the arguments for it being like a spectrum is that you can't launch a decentralized protocol or smart contract or application, from from its sort of inception. It has to begin with some sort of embryo, and this is often referred to in the crypto industry, at least, as the origin address. Right? You're familiar?
Yeah, yeah, the genesis. I would say, as a matter of principle, one could have very fully decentralized networks, and we can have very fully centralized networks, and one can also have networks that are at various positions along the spectrum from centralized to decentralized. I think it is possible to launch a system in a fully decentralized way from the get-go in principle, but that's not sort of the most natural and efficient way to do things in the current world. So what we see in the current world, certainly in the software and the blockchain context, we see a modality of progressive decentralization where a small team of people launches something perhaps in a relatively centralized way, and then they spin it out in a way that it becomes more and more decentralized over time. And I would say both the internet and the Linux community, which are my go-to examples of decentralized networks of various sorts in the modern tech world, both of these began in a more centralized way and then became more and more decentralized networks over time. So there's not a big mystery or any contradiction there. I mean, you can start something in the spirit of decentralization, even though you are exerting some centralized power to launch it, right? And then you can let it become more decentralized. I mean, just as you can, if you're raising children, you can raise them with a view toward freedom and letting them, run off and do their own thing. That doesn't mean you have to give them maximal freedom when they're 2 years old, right? I mean, you can exert your centralized force to put them in a position where they can be decentralized in an optimal way later on. I think there's a lot of confusion in the modern blockchains world about decentralization. Not so much because it's an intrinsically confusing concept, just because there's a lot of bullshit and deception in the blockchain world, right? So decentralization has become a buzzword. So then you have a bunch of networks which are claiming to be decentralized when some of them are actually very centrally controlled, but behind the scenes. And I mean, that's just deception, like happens in all walks of human life, right? I wouldn't say the traditional corporate world is especially less deceptive. It just manifests its deceptiveness in different ways.
Precisely. I often, I try to pick away underneath the marketing and the techno babble, if you like, and try to kind of understand how is this, how are these smart contracts and these protocols that running these lending product, all the different various financial DeFi products, and often you just scratch beneath the surface and it's exactly the same as capitalism, business as usual.
Well, you can look in blockchain. DeFi is its own thing, which is interesting to talk about. If you just look at blockchain networks, I mean, Bitcoin, in a sense, is the most decentralized of all of them, in the sense that, I mean, the guy who launched it then disappeared, and so it's just being operated by the users. Now, still, there's a relatively small number of Bitcoin whales who, in practice, control the market. So it's oligopolistic in a way, but that's not wired into the infrastructure, right? And you then have other blockchains. I mean, you have some that are famously controlled by a small number of parties, right? I mean, EOS is one example where it was documented from the early stages. There's a very small number of EOS block producers who, in fact, control the network. Cardano, while the founder, Charles Hoskinson, is still active, and his company IOHK does most of the development of Cardano blockchain, I mean, there's a quite wide diversity of token holders and stake pool operators and so forth. So they've made a real effort to make the overall operation of Cardano blockchain decentralized. But again, the degree to which a given blockchain is decentralized is noticed only by a few hardcore geeks, right? Because I mean, otherwise in the media universe, everyone throws that term around, and if you're not highly technical, like, how do you tell the difference, right? And I think the same is true with decentralized finance, right? I mean, there's some DeFi protocols out there that are pretty much like one guy or one company using blockchain to operate a tokenomic finance system. I mean, it may be what they're doing is a good way to make money. It may be innovative on the level of quantitative finance. It's still run by a small set of people as a centralized financial protocol on top of blockchain and smart contracts, right? And then there are other DeFi networks out there right now that are more fundamentally decentralized in their operation. I'd say there's nothing out there that says decentralized as Linux or the internet yet in the blockchain world. On the other hand, blockchain hasn't been around that long as a major force. So I would say that's coming. I mean, I think progressive decentralization is a real thing, and it does take years, given the pace at which people's mindsets develop and the pace at which software development happens.
Yeah, I think it seems like a lot of the controversies or hypocrisies around the decentralization value proposition now is often comes back to this idea of the benevolent dictator. So most people that gather around, tribes, altcoin tribes, or they get very, very embedded in the community, and they become somewhat fanatical about their coin. And often there's in the case of Bitcoin, it's Satoshi, but there are numerous other icons that.
Yeah, I mean, the power of a charismatic leader to rally together a tribe of followers is real. On the other hand, the Linux community shows that a decentralized network can foster a variety of different charismatic tribal leaders, right? So I mean, you have Linus Torvalds, and he's still leading Linux kernel team, which is great. But I mean, Mark Shuttleworth came and did his thing with Ubuntu Linux, which arguably helped bring Linux to more of the masses. And he has his own supporters, but you don't have to follow that, right? And then I mean, Huawei came along, funded by an almost homologous to Chinese government, right? And they have their own smartphone OS now, which they made by like forking the most open source parts of Android and adding their own stuff on top of it. That's all Linux under the hood. And
It's a fair point.
They're not part of the cult of Linus Torvalds or Mark Shuttleworth, right? They're part of the cult of Xi Jinping. And I mean, so I think when it becomes big enough, and if it's architected well enough, a decentralized protocol, a decentralized network can host a variety of different cults and charismatic leaders within it. It doesn't have to be one cult per a decentralized network, basically.
It's a fair comparison, I guess. The only thing I'm missing there, though, is the economic layer. So Linux, when people come and build on Linux, there is no expectation of a token pumping, right?
The economic aspect is different, although I think the economics of open source is generally misunderstood. I mean, the majority of development on open source projects like Linux is not just volunteers doing it in their spare time, right? I mean, it's mostly companies that are contributing to Linux because they're then using Linux in their own business models. So there's an economics associated with it, and there's the status economics of the open source world intersects interestingly with the business economics of companies using Linux, and there's all sorts of nasty shit that goes down, right? I mean, what Google did with Linux and Android is subtle, right? There's open bits of Android, then there's bits that are more constrained by Google licenses, and there's exploitative aspects there. But yet Huawei managed to route around those in various ways, right? So it's not all love and roses just because it's open source, and there's all kinds of nasty money games going on there. But the open aspect, due to the sort of viral nature of the open source licenses, managed to sort of keep going in spite of the nasty money and status games happening on top of it. Indeed, blockchain networks are a little different, and I think there's pluses and minuses there, right? I mean, there's the tokenomic aspect, which on the one hand leads to this whole speculative pump and dumponomics. On the other hand, if you look at what you need to make AI really decentralized and open, you could argue the cryptonomics aspect fills in some needed aspects. So the thing is, with AI, having open source code isn't enough, because with AI, what matters is what happens when the code meets the data and meets the processors, right? So I mean, like the open source code underlying transformer neural networks doesn't help me train GPT-3 on my laptop, because GPT-3 took like 20 million bucks of computer time and all the data from the web and a bunch of hard drives and in RAM, right? So it's not enough just to have open source code. You need to have a decentralized and open, in some senses, method for having the code meet the data, meet the processing power to deliver services. And that takes money, right? So somehow you need money to be more explicitly woven into the decentralized networks. Otherwise, you get cases like TensorFlow where the code is open, but it doesn't matter because most people who have that open code don't have the money to use it in the way that it's intended to be used, but Google and OpenAI and so forth do, right? So you, in a way, you do need money woven into the decentralized networks. Now, whether current blockchain networks are doing that in the right way to foster positive development of AI, medicine, and everything else, that's a different question. Mostly they aren't, right? And there's a lot of evolution that needs to happen. But again, you can analogize that to the evolution of open source licenses, which are numerous, and the open source licenses have been evolving over time and are still evolving, right? And I think that there's a certain mix of GPL type licenses and MIT or Apache type licenses, which is used now, and that mix is important and has evolved over time, and there are subtleties there, right? So I think there's a lot of evolution that still needs to happen in the blockchain space, and the evolution of decentralized governance, I'd say, is still in an early stage, right? Because you have two extremes of like $1, one vote, which is the default now, right? And this is how my own Singularity Net platform works. And that's how pretty much every major blockchain network works. But I mean, there's obvious pathologies to $1, one vote, right? Because I mean, you have token whales, you have funds, they're going to accumulate most of the money, and then they get more votes. So I mean, buying votes is a feature rather than a bug, but there's obvious problems to that. On the other hand, one human, one vote, people don't like in the blockchain world because they don't want to do like KYC and disclose who they are in every case. But I mean, one human, one vote also has its problems, as we see in Western democracies like the US or Australia, right? I mean, because most people don't want to think very much about what they're voting for. So then you just have a slightly less subtle way of buying votes, right? I mean, instead of just buying the token to buy the votes, you buy ads that tell like ignorant sheep-like voters who to vote for, and then they do. So finding the right way to do decentralized governance that bypasses these pathologies it's a hard problem. It's a hard problem for political democracy. And I think there are ways to make decentralized reputation systems that can bypass some of these problems, but we need more cycles of experimenting, like with how to do decentralized reputation and liquid democracy in ways that don't suck, right? So I don't say all the problems are solved, and I don't say current blockchain networks are especially healthy. What I would say is bringing money into the equation explicitly in the decentralized network is probably necessary if decentralized networks are going to have the thoroughgoing impact that I would like them to have.
Yeah, no, it's been very interesting to learn about decentralized autonomous organizations and what have you, and how they plan to do certain governance by delegation, for example, if you have trusted nodes, or even individuals that you can pass your vote over to. That
is really the most real that liquid democracy has gotten, right? I mean, a number of us who are sort of governance geeks have been interested in liquid democracy for a long time. There's been proposals to use it in parliaments of countries and states and so forth. But I'd say within the blockchain world, delegation of votes actually is done, right? So I mean, that's interesting governance experimentation, but it certainly needs to go a lot further.
Definitely. And when it comes to proof of work versus proof of stake, many people say proof of work is a lot more secure, a lot more robust, and yet probably the majority of the coins and tokens out there and what have you are proof of stake these days. It's very popular, right?
Yeah, I
So
wouldn't say proof of work is more secure, really. I mean, proof in the end, a proof of work or a proof of stake network, unless very well architected, is susceptible to takeover by someone with a lot of money. I mean, in Bitcoin, you can buy a lot of machines, and you can make a chip fabrication facility that makes chips that will mine much more efficiently in terms of cost and energy than anybody else, and you can game the network that way. And I mean, there are proof of reputation protocols that are not widely rolled out, but that are harder to game than standard proof of work or proof of stake methods. I mean, I think that the frustrating issue with the currently dominant proof of work methodologies is just they waste a lot of energy for no good reason, right? And I mean that's why I didn't love Bitcoin from the get-go. I'm like, we're wasting electricity, we're heating up the atmosphere, like we're giving coal miners cancer, and so that we can solve these meaningless number crunching problems to do the proof of work for a transaction, when clearly there are other algorithms that aren't so wasteful, right? So, I mean, proof of stake gets rid of that problem, which is a good thing. And again, proof of stake is not one algorithm. It's a broad class of algorithms. You can do it better or you can do it worse. You can do it more or less securely and with more or less protection against various types of gaming. So I think proof of reputation will be the future in various forms, which is a natural extension of proof of stake. But I mean, I think the way Cardano does proof of stake is pretty good, but there's a lot of other good blockchains out there. The way Algorand does it is pretty good. I think in general, the new generation of proof of stake blockchains is pretty solid and not much risk of being hacked or being taken over by sort of economic attacks, and much lower cost of operation. So the technology is maturing. I mean, fairly rapidly in the scheme of things, although not necessarily as rapidly as the hype is blossoming, right?
yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's just let's imagine for a moment that we've reached a position where we have a functioning DAO, which is fully decentralized from the get-go using AGI. I'd assume that's the only way we could actually pull this off. How do we prevent a repeat of capitalism as usual under this model? Because I think it will be very easy to fall back into the same trap that we.
I think so first of all, I want to unpack for a minute what a DAO is, right? Because this is sort of a vague term. So yeah, the purest notion of a DAO would be a fully automated organization that is both a decentralized network of agents and doesn't need a human in the loop. So it's like a decentralized network of fully automated agents. Now, a lot of things that are being called a DAO now are really decentralized networks of human agents, right? And that is fine. It's still interesting. I mean, it's a decentralized organization, which is basically a collective, right? It's a collective of human beings who are interacting via computer interface, and in that sense, those humans could be replaced by AIs using the same computer interface. But so I think the emergence of decentralized collectives, primarily operated by humans via anonymous internet interfaces, decentralized collective of humans interacting via anonymous computational interface is an interesting thing, even when there's no AI involved. And of course, there's a kind of organization that's also ideally suited to be operated by AIs as their intelligence emerges, right? And as far as the dynamics of capitalism goes, it really comes down to the network design, right? I mean, I think that there is a fundamental dynamic of concentration of wealth, which happens even if there's no dishonesty and even if no one is malevolent, right? So, I mean, if you just, there's plenty of game theory results showing if you have a bunch of parties just interactively playing gambling games and betting against each other, but they all need to survive in the sense they can't afford to go broke totally, right? Then what you'll have is a dynamic where randomly one participant of the game will get richer than the others just because he got lucky on some bet. But now that they're randomly richer, they have a bigger stockpile of wealth. They can use that bigger stockpile to out manipulate everyone else because there's bigger bets they can take that others can't take without getting too close to bankruptcy. So in an iterated gambling game among multiple fair, honest participants with some noise in it, right? Random noise will cause some guys to get richer in the early stages, then they can leverage that to get richer and richer, and you'll have massive wealth inequality, right? So, I mean, in human economic systems, you have this game theoretic dynamics layered on top of all sorts of dishonesty and scheming and corruption, right? But even without that, there's just an intrinsic rich get richer dynamic, and you see the same thing in non-monetary domains too, right? Like why are there a few pop stars who are super big, and then most musicians make almost no money? Because the more popular you are, the easier it is to get more and more and more popular. And these are just network dynamics phenomena, like they're graph dynamics phenomena. And you can design a dynamical system that works around that if you want to, right? So, I mean, the way to work around that in an economy is just progressive taxation, right? I mean, it's pretty clear. If you have a progressive taxation system, it counteracts this dynamic of concentration of wealth and redistributes. And this is controversial politically, but it's pretty obvious just from a dynamical systems perspective, and it's what happens in Scandinavia. It's what happened in Australia when I lived there in the 90s. I paid like almost half my income in tax when I was a researcher at UWA. On the other hand, you know, I got state health care. At that point, there was free university tuition in Australia. Like you saw, there's higher tax and higher services, and this counteracts the mathematical tendency of wealth to concentrate. And US people don't like that, right? But in blockchain networks, you could have a lot subtler dynamics than a crude progressive taxation, right? Because these are computational networks with a lot more degrees of freedom, and the progressive taxation doesn't have to take the form of money. It could take the form of, you know, access to data, access to intelligent API calls, access to knowledge, right?
Yeah, well, it reminds me.
Take a lot of forms, but in the end, it's like, what do you wire into? How do you build the decentralized networks? Do you build them in such a way that is intended to maximize the growth and intelligence of the network, or do you build them in a way that's intended to maximize the right of any given party to concentrate as much wealth as possible if they happen to get lucky, right?
Yeah, no, you're right, and it just reminded me there for a second of the China's credit score system. So they start with everybody gets 100 points, and you know, certain behaviour will dip you below that mark, and positive behaviour will push you above that mark, but it's capped at something like 15 or 16 points. So you can't deviate a great deal below or beyond that point.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese government is now looking at tech billionaires and so on, and they're saying like, well, actually, it's not good for our overall society to have anyone concentrate this much wealth. It's not necessary. So let's like they want people to be able to get rich as entrepreneurs, but not that rich, right? Which is totally sensible. It happens that these various sensible things the Chinese government is doing are being done, in the interest of a system that is very oppressive in other ways, like squashing freedom of speech and religion and so forth. So, I mean, what you need is a decentralized network that democratically agrees to regulate itself in ways like this. And I think the Icelandic government is probably a better model than the Chinese government overall. That's been a democracy since like 800 AD with a progressive taxation system and
but a lot smaller.
They've even got some pirate party representatives in their parliament.
I'm aware. But it's a much smaller nation. I think something happens at that sort of, China scale.
Well, for humans, right? But this is where you get into the difference with a system run by AIs, right? So with humans, indeed, each of us can only deal with a few hundred closely connected people. And this tends to help contribute to the rise of oligarchies and oligopolies, where you have like a ruling class where everybody knows each other and gossips back and forth and shares insider tips. And the crypto community elite is a bit like that too, right? But on the other hand, AIs don't have a Dunbar number. They don't have a 7 plus or minus 2 like short-term memory capacity. So there's no reason that AIs have to layer tribalism on top of the network dynamics that lead to concentration of wealth, which is what human beings do.
Interesting. Decentralization. Who wins and who loses by which mechanisms of power?
My hope is that what happens on the whole over the next couple of decades as humanity approaches a technological singularity, my hope is everybody wins in an objective sense, in the sense that essentially everyone on Earth should be getting more and more and more than what they have now at a faster and faster rate. And I mean, to make that happen will require many reorganizations of current socioeconomic systems. On the other hand, if the way you're measuring how well you're doing is as a ratio of how well everyone else is doing, then that's a different point, right? I mean, then some of the current elites will lose in that sense. The gap between them and everyone else will shrink, right? So I mean, I think if decentralization is done right, it should lead to a decrease in inequality of various forms, and that will make some people feel like losers because the difference between themselves and their neighbors or people in Africa or something is not as big as it was before. And that, that's a real practical issue, because that is how many people measure success. It's like how much better than everybody else are they doing? I mean, but I would also say decentralization is just a lack of centralization, and you could make decentralized networks that are even worse in terms of leading to wealth and power inequality than current centralized networks, right? It really depends how the decentralization is carried out. I mean, as I've often said, if you look at governance, Somalia is a decentralized government, which means like there's not much government. There's a bunch of mercenaries roaming around, like kidnapping people's 10-year-old sons and forcing them to join their mercenary armies, right? So I mean, lack of centralization could be better or worse than centralization, right? I mean, the devil is in the details. Of course, how I would like to see it work out is in a way that leads to broad benefit and a decrease in inequality of wealth, knowledge, and power. Not everyone in the blockchain space looks at it that way. I mean, I think I'm fairly anarcho-socialist on a political level. I'd say. I mean, I grew up among Marxists, really, and kind of. I mean, I came to the realization that there's some things in Marxism that don't agree with empirical reality as I observed it, and I hate fascist dictatorships as much as the next crazy American, right? But yet, I think I came into all this from a point of view of like how could we make democratic socialism really work? Like how can we use decentralized governance and democracy to decrease inequality and uplift everyone in a way that preserves as much freedom as possible? You have a strain of hardcore political libertarianism in the crypto world, and the strain of like, well, the richer you are, the better you are, and you know, if someone isn't doing well, that's not my problem. So I mean, you could have crypto networks built on that philosophy. You could have crypto networks built on more of a sort of anarcho-socialist philosophy, and you could have crypto markets and crypto networks based on a pure like opportunistic personal wealth accumulation philosophy, and all these things are out there now, right? And it's a teeming self-organizing mess, which is fun and interesting, but objectively you have to say it's not clear which kind of network is going to rise to the top.